Yes. Oops. All right. Let us no longer cut into Alex's time, which, by the way, of course, we can take a little bit longer after. But anyway, go ahead.
So thank you to everyone who stuck it out for my talk, especially those of you in Eastern Europe and Western Asia. I think we've lost everyone east of Ankara now. I don't see anyone on the list anymore in East Asia or Australia, and I'm sorry they missed it, but that's the nature of global events. Since someone asked Robert about the complicity of university administrations in the crisis of the social sciences. And since I'm in the middle of what will probably be an 8-year sentence as department chair, I guess I can comment on that briefly. I mean, we are complicit up to the gills. You know, I am the chair of a department of philosophy, and I'm routinely required to produce data, what data in quotation marks, for institutional use in evaluating our attainment of various outcomes. And I explain that the sort of quantitative fetishism is just furthering spurious precision. It doesn't give us anything. And then when I do this, someone says, "Oh, you're a philosopher. Let me explain the math." I understand the fucking math. Pardon my language. It's that it's not the math that's the problem. It's that the conditions under which statistical models are applicable don't apply. So my talk is on the interactive timescales of cognition and action. And since I'm one of the people scheduled for today, I guess one of the senior panelists, I find that a little bit funny, but I am approximately the same generation as Itai and Georgi, who also presented today. So I'll take it. Some of you everyone who's spoken today has also talked about their encounter with and their history with Mark's work. I took a job I finished my PhD in the early 1990s in philosophy of science, and my second job out of graduate school was at Lehigh University. That job did a lot of things for me, but one way in which I look at it retrospectively is as a kind of 10-year postdoc with Mark Bickard. So I learned a huge amount. It's informed every aspect of my work, and I don't contribute to the project nearly as often as I would like, but today I'm going to try. My paper has 4 sections. After an introduction, I didn't do a PowerPoint because it would just contain text, so why bother? After an introduction, after explaining where I'm coming from, I will talk first about teleosemantics, then about the historicity of anticipations for the interactivist, and then finally, in my conclusion, I will get to the interactive timescales of cognition and action. And in that portion, I hope to say a couple things of substance. So in the literature adjacent to this conference and in talks given to this point, I have found many references to history, as for example, in the evolutionary history of an organism that underwrites the biological functions within that organism, according to Ruth Millikan. And I've also encountered many references to anticipation, as in the anticipations whose interactive success or failure constitutes truth value, according to Mark Bickard. Now, talking about diachronic processes is challenging, and it is doubtless unreasonable to expect that anyone doing so, whether in a retrospective or a prospective mode, explain precisely what frame of reference they have in mind when they talk about the past or the future. Our evolutionary history unfolded over at least 1 billion years, possibly much longer. By contrast, a frog's interaction with a fly crossing into its visual field, or a BB crossing into its visual field, or whatever, takes perhaps 70 milliseconds, by the end of which time the prey has been ingested. I am not the first person to make the point that time scale matters. Now, this point may itself be uncontroversial, but it is frequently neglected. While it's unreasonable to expect retrospective or prospective discussions of process to be fully explicit, lack of precision in such discussions can leave one feeling that the relevant timescale has been chosen arbitrarily. So let me begin by choosing one completely arbitrary timescale. In intellectual history, a century makes for a nice round number. All right, 100 years ago today, the marked page proofs of Roy Wood Sellers' book, Evolutionary Naturalism, may well have been making their way by rail from the author's home in Michigan to Open Court Press in Chicago in time for the 1922 publication. This nearly forgotten classic of 20th century philosophy, seldom read, but with tendrils of influence reaching well into the present, helped to shape both Salarzian naturalism and process metaphysics, approaches dear to many of those in attendance here today. Roy Wood Sellers envisioned evolutionary naturalism as a philosophical system, his words, in a sense of system that was very much out of fashion, though he hoped to bring it back. If Mark Bickard's interactivism has not gotten quite the traction that he and others, including myself, might have wished, it is at least in part because the hope Sellers expressed in 1922 for the renewal of philosophy's systematic ambitions has never been fulfilled. Interactivism, too, is a philosophical system. It's an attempt to simultaneously address the complementary or even competing demands of ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology. I take this to be precisely what Mark meant yesterday, for example, when he spoke of interactivist efforts to establish the normative metaphysics of emergence. Like Roy Wood Sellers' evolutionary naturalism, interactivism assumes from the outset that, and here I quote from Sellers, knowledge is a human affair, even though that which is known is distinct from the knower, but man is a part of nature, and so the capacities and processes operative in science and philosophy must find their natural explanation. Intelligence must be given its locus and attachments. In other words, science and philosophy are properties of man. To explain them, we must comprehend man's capacities and his place in the world. The final problem of philosophy is to connect the fact and content of knowledge with its conditions. How does knowing occur in the kind of world that is actually known? Knowing is a fact and must be connected up with the world must be connected up with the world which the sciences study. Thus, a system of philosophy answering this question is the capstone of science. Philosophy is the science which explains the other sciences as human achievements and thereby complete science. I love the passage. It could have been written today, except for the now antiquated use of the masculine generic. So science and philosophy, like other human activities, take place within the same natural world that gave rise to human beings, including the practitioners of science and philosophy. Our interactions with each other and our actions in the world constitute our shared epistemic objects. In turn, our interactions with each other and with those shared epistemic objects constitute the meanings we ascribe to those objects and to any representations we form of them. It has become commonplace to say that all of these interactions must take place, as they say, in real time. The phrase in real time has been in common use in cognitive science for decades. It can be found in much the same sense in a paper that's been cited several times already in this conference, Rodney Brooks's now classic 1991 paper, Intelligence Without Representation. In that paper, he insists that the intelligent performance of what he calls his creatures must be validated, quote, in real time. And that toward that end, it is unnecessary to build such creatures to form explicit representations either of their world or of themselves. What is somewhat less commonplace, though by no means uncommon, is an explicit account of the scale, boundary conditions, or fine-grainedness of real time. Many such accounts take as their point of departure the multiple overlapping timescales of biological time described in Arthur Winfrey's 1980 classic, The Geometry of Biological Time. People inspired by Winfrey include, to cite just three, Robert Port and Timothy Van Gelder in their treatment of the dynamics of cognition in their 1995 book, Mind is Motion. James Crutchfield in his 1999 paper, Is Anything Ever New? Considering Emergence. And Hannah de Jager and Ezekiel de Paulo in their interactivist approach to social cognition in their 2007 paper, Participatory Sense-Making. Another common port of departure, which is shared both by Roy Wood Sellers and at the other end of the 20th century by Francisco Varela, is William James's proto-phenomenological diagnosis and critique of what he called the specious present in his 1890 Principles of Psychology. So there's a contemporary of Wilhelm Wundt for you, Robert. I have neither the time nor the inclination to attempt any systematic critical survey of this literature here. My intention is instead to draw attention to what I take to be an invitation in interactivism to think through the content or meaning of cognition and action in a way that divorces them from reliance on any privileged timescale. Like many of you, I have had the pleasure of lurking on the pre-conference reading group for the past several weeks. So I shall take as my critical focus the exposition of teleosemantics in Ruth Millikan's 2020 paper, Neuroscience and Teleosemantics. I use this as a target because it's recent and because a lot of you have read it, but it's just a target of convenience, a sample of convenience, as it were. So section 1, teleosemantics. As Millikan observes, quote, most of those who examined or adopted the teleosemantic position assumed that a thing's function was what it had been designed or selected for doing by a person, by natural selection, or by some analogous developmental or social learning process. If there are representations in the brain, they were produced by mechanisms selected by natural selection for producing representations. The body is filled, after all, with thousands of the most intricate and clever mechanisms that no Darwinian would doubt are there owing to natural selection. I want to take a closer look at the claim, at Ruth Millikan's claim that, quote, a thing's function is what it has been designed or selected for doing by a person by natural selection or by some analogous developmental or social learning process. I don't think the claim is false, but it is certainly imprecise. When the imprecisions gloss over radical disparities in time scale, they matter quite a lot. So there are two analogies at work in Millikan's gloss of the teleosemantic position. The first is an analogy sometimes attributed to Darwin himself, the analogy between agential design and natural selection. Well, okay. The first two chapters of Darwin's Origin of Species are titled Variation Under Domestication and Variation Under Nature, respectively. Those chapters establish similarities between the breeds of a given domesticated organism on the one hand, and species of a given naturally occurring genus on the other. Together with chapter 3, Struggle for Existence, these chapters set the stage for chapter 4, Natural Selection. The very use of the term selection in the phrase natural selection implies some kinship with human choice. What is less clear is how close a kinship this really is. In his autobiography, Charles Darwin famously spoke of his admiration during his college years at Cambridge for the reasoning of William Paley, the Anglican theologian destined to be remembered for his watchmaker analogy, dutifully taken out of context in so many textbooks over the past century. Paley too offered an analogy between the function of a thing designed or selected for the performance of that function by a person and the functions of naturally occurring things or aspects of those things. Darwin would offer an argument from analogy similar to Paley's, but founded on what he clearly understood to be a very different analogy, one that dispensed with the need to attribute agency to nature. No selector in natural selection. If design and natural selection were operationally equivalent, then natural selection could underwrite function in the same way as design. If that were the case, then we could employ what Daniel Dennett in his 1987 book called the design stance to biological systems without having to take too much care to treat such applications merely instrumentally, merely metaphorically. But whether natural selection and design are operationally equivalent in the relevant sense is surely an empirical question, one for which the answer is a resounding no. Anyone still unconvinced of this in 1988 should have been fully persuaded by the results coming out of Richard Lenski's laboratory in Michigan State for the last 33 years. The elegance of Lenski's experiment resides in its use of a bacterial model organism to study natural selection in the laboratory on the time scale of a human scientific career. Though it has been underway for only one human generation, the disparity between the human life cycle and that of E. coli has allowed the participants in this study to measure the divergent evolution of populations under reproductive isolation for over 50,000 bacterial generations. 50,000 human generations would take about 1.5 million years, a span of time certainly inimical to the funding cycle of laboratory science. The last 1.5 million years of human evolution are instead the province of paleoanthropology. The second analogy at work in Millikan's capsule summary of teleosemantics assimilates design and natural selection on the one hand to what she calls, quote, analogous developmental or learning processes on the other. Development and learning may indeed involve something like Darwinian random variation and selective retention. Certainly, neural development appears to turn in part on such processes. Once again, however, timescale matters. Evolution, for organisms, the duration of whose life cycles fall within an order of magnitude of our own, takes place over geological time. Even if the individual organism is the primary or sole unit of selection, it is not the unit of evolution. An individual organism does not evolve. Populations or lineages evolve. Development and learning, by contrast, take place on a timescale defined by the organism's life cycle and are localized to particular individual organisms in their actions with their environment. In turn, the random variation and selective retention that takes place within populations of the organism's somatic cells may help constitute the organism's development and learning, but it is the organism that develops and learns, not the cells. Now, in some respects, cells, organisms, and lineages may all be analogous. There are also, however, very significant differences in kind. For example, when a new species evolves, when a speciation event takes place, the members of the parent species need not in any way be less complex than those of the daughter species. The same is true of the two species themselves. A daughter species is not an embryo or an infant in any way remotely analogous to the embryo or infant offspring of an organism like us, bound by the Weismannian segregation of germ and soma. Each of us begins as a single-celled zygote, compelled in each generation to develop, rediscover all of the complexity of which we are capable, and compelled in each generation to learn everything we can learn. Such dish analogies are significant in ways that teleosemantics cannot capture. Of course, to be fair, teleosemantics, at least as Millikan has expounded it, does not pretend to capture them. Such differences are, however, the province of the normative metaphysics of emergence. So to be successful, the interactivist program must do them justice. Section 2, the historicity of anticipations. For the interactivist, the truth value of an organism's representations, and with it, such other semantic properties as they might have, consists in the interactive success or failure of its anticipations. From an interactivist perspective, I am not especially troubled by the apparent failure of teleosemantics with its retrospective orientation to account for the causal powers attributable to functions in the present and future, because I am not any more troubled by the idea of a causal connection between time-like separated events A and B that fails to reduce to causal connections along a continuous chain between A and B than I am by the idea of a causal connection in general. In other words, yeah, history cannot, we have no account of how history can have any causal efficacy in the present that is not captured by present state, but we don't have any account of causal efficacy of present states either. As Richard Campbell pointed out this morning, neither current philosophy nor current physics furnishes us with an account of either. A teleosemantic account of the functions of anticipation may well prove an important step toward laying the groundwork for the normative metaphysics of emergence that interactivism demands. It cannot help, however, unless it can first succeed on its own terms, where to do so, it must squarely address the timescales of historicity in a way that answers the objections I've just rehearsed. Returning for just a moment to Roy Wood Sellers' evolutionary naturalism, I want to point toward an object lesson to be gleaned from the present obscurity of this centenarian book. Seller had almost all of the ingredients for both a teleosemantics and a normative metaphysics of emergence compatible with interactivism. First of all, he was a philosophical naturalist who understood that philosophical naturalism had to be informed not just by physics, but by all of the special sciences, including the life sciences. Naturalism should not collapse into reductive physicalism. Second, Roy Wood Sellers was a careful student both of Darwin and of post-Darwinian evolutionary theory, as it was understood at the time, including the work of his contemporaries then in the process of compiling what would come to be called the modern synthesis. Third, he had a robust concept of emergence, though he rejected the idealism on which the British emergentists had founded that concept. Finally, he understood that the foundation of Kantian philosophy, consideration of the conditions for the possibility of experience and knowledge, could itself be naturalized, informed by scientific insights, whether physical, biological, or psychological, into the historical emergence of human experience and knowledge. That most of his work, Sellers' work, now gathers dust in libraries is in part a function of historical contingency, or bad luck, if you will. But such contingency is evident in a great many historical processes as we now understand them. I take it that this is the insight enshrined in the title of the wonderful 2001 collection, edited by Susan Oyama, Paul Griffith, and Russell Gray, Cycles of Contingency. So what are the relevant timescales of historicity? What are some of the timescales of historicity relevant to the normative metaphysics of emergence, specifically to the emergence of the normativity of human and human-like interactions in real time? In the vein of a naturalized Kantianism, I continue the conditions for its possibility, for the possibility of this normative emergence. Some of the most fundamental boundary conditions must surely have been established on the cosmological timescale. The universe is about 14 billion years old. Protons arose quite early in that history, but heavier baryonic matter took considerably more time. Our sun is a third or fourth generation star. It and its satellites contain heavy elements dispersed in the large supernovas that punctuated the end of life cycle events of prior stellar generations. Without an abundance of such elements, terrestrial life as we know it would be impossible. For its part, the Earth is about 4 billion years old. Evidence suggests that its early atmosphere was weakly reducing, primarily nitrogen and carbon dioxide, dense enough to trap heat from a less luminous sun and to allow liquid water to exist in abundance. Photosynthetic life arose perhaps 3.5 billion years ago, producing oxygen as a waste product. This waste set to work oxidizing everything it could, beginning with a vast repository of dissolved iron in the oceans. Only when the planet had reached nearly half its present age, so only after 2 billion years, had this process progressed far enough to allow free oxygen to begin to accumulate in the ocean shallows in the atmosphere, which until about 1 billion years ago had been nearly anoxic. Subsequent aerobic life began to evolve various modes of multicellular complexity, including such multicellular animals as parazoa and metazoa. At our best guess, metazoa, that's us, right, evolved perhaps 800 million years ago. I single them out because it is in metazoa that we see the emergence of the Weissmannian segregation of German soma that I talked about a moment ago. Metazoan complexity is thus constrained by reproductive bottlenecks of the sort that we face, with each individual organism starting life as a single-celled zygote. The Ediacarian formations, approximately 550 million years old, contain the first evidence of bilaterians, the clade of bilaterally symmetrical metazoa that includes arthropods, annelids, flatworms, mollusks, and of course, chordates. That's us, right? Though modern bilaterians are extremely diverse, most of them have through guts, as opposed to cnidarian blind guts. That is to say, most of them have at least two holes. And in most of those, the most important sensory organs are situated near the orifice of ingestion, the mouth, and opposite the orifice of excretion. Animals in general move or behave. Bilaterian animals do not just move. They are going somewhere. They've got places to go. Their body plans impose intrinsic direction. They are traveling toward the food, toward the potential mates, away from the poop. Many metazoa have nervous systems like cnidarian nerve nets, but only bilaterians have central nervous systems, including brains and brain-like structures for the coordination of motion embodies with implicit direction. Evidence for the first chordates is equivocal, but sufficient to allow us to date the emergence of our own phylum to no later than 540 billion years ago. Chordates, too, are extremely diverse, displaying a vast range of sensory structures and modes of locomotion. Many of us rely on smell and sight. As Don Campbell frequently observed, we chordates often find ourselves moving through media such as water and air that are both transparent to sight and olfaction and penetrable to locomotion. When we consider real-time interactions of the sort on which human agents test their anticipations, it is perceptual transparency and locomotive penetrability that makes them possible. By this point, it should be clear that our temporal scope has narrowed from the cosmological timescale to the geological timescale, within which most Darwinian evolution can be seen to operate. The emergence of the hominin lineage, defined as the lineage of apes more closely related to us than to the chimps. By contrast, the hominin lineage, the emergence of the hominin lineage is an extremely recent event in geological time, and crucial events in its subsequent evolution are both too recent and too fast-paced for the resolution of many of the core methods of geology to capture them. In focusing on the hominin lineage, we thus find ourselves on the boundary between the geological timescale and the finer grained timescale of paleoanthropology. It is within this boundary zone that we find that natural selection is constrained by environmental changes that cannot themselves be understood as a consequence of natural selection in the canonical sense. One recent event in hominin evolution that has proved very, very distracting to cognitive science is the emergence of really, really large brains. Against these brains, against the emergence of such brains, there are many, many prima facie selection pressures. Large cranial volume at birth imposes greater risks of infant and maternal mortality. Together with extended neoteny, such factors make reproduction extremely expensive. The development and operation of a large brain is also a huge metabolic burden. Of interest for our purposes is the fact that the evolution of large brains is preceded not only by bipedal locomotion, but by the shrinkage of the abdominal cavity and the concomitant descent of the thoracic cavity. For the past 2 million years, hominins appear to have had large intestines much shorter, both than those of their Australopithecine ancestors and those of our closest living relatives. As Richard Wrangham and others have hypothesized, Wrangham is a Harvard evolutionary anthropologist. As they've hypothesized, these changes were conditioned by the invention by some of the earliest members of genus Homo of the cultural and technological means to reduce the physiological burden of metabolizing food and eliminating waste by shifting part of that burden to an environment in which safe and reliable access to fire could be taken as given. In short, Homo habilis, or some similar hominin, developed cultural mechanisms for the consistent transmission of technologies for the ignition, maintenance, and quenching of fires, and for cooking foodstuffs. Access to cooked foods allowed subsequent hominins to get by with shorter intestines, to spend less of their time eating and digesting, and to make vast quantities of glucose readily available to their big fat brains. Only then, on this argument, could the prima facie selection pressures against large brains be overcome. Evolution by natural selection in the hominin lineage is thus conditioned by cultural change. Culture, in some sense, has to come first, and in a fairly robust sense. If the paleoanthropological timescale arises at the resolution limit of geological time, so the historical timescale arises at the resolution limit of paleoanthropological time. Human history and prehistory, properly so called, understood in other words as defined by the presence or absence of written records, are as constitutive of human anticipations as is our evolutionary trajectory. In late prehistory, following the Neolithic demographic transition, we once again find evidence for human cultures changing the environmental constraints under which natural selection operated on our ancestors. The evolution of adult lactose tolerance, for example, appears to have taken place in post-agrarian populations. It looks like it happened at least 4 times. Only in a post-agrarian society would adult lactose tolerance increase fitness. The anticipations with which I approach my interactions with a block of cheddar in my fridge must be understood as having been constituted in part by these evolutionary events unfolding on the time scale of historical time, not geological or paleoanthropological time. At its limit, the historical time scale overlaps with the time scale of learning and development. There are numerous examples that show us how human history, understood as history properly so called, co-constitutes the anticipations of individual human agents. I content myself for the present purposes with the historical emergence of universal literacy. I dare say that all of us, regardless of where we live, take it for granted. In universal literacy, the universality is defined relative to a particular society. It's defined as 95% of the adult population having certain minimal competence. Though not all contemporary societies satisfy this definition, the phenomenon of universal literacy continues to spread with the active encouragement of policymakers and civil society groups worldwide. What many of us find surprising when we learn of it for the first time is the fact that, with a few exceptions, universal literacy is essentially unknown prior to the 20th century. When I was born in the middle of that century, I had 6 living great-grandparents, 2 of whom were illiterate. I dare say most of us had illiterate ancestors within the past 3 generations. Rather remarkable, considering how few illiterate people any of us actually knows. As universal literacy has become entrenched, social pressure to instill literacy in children has increased, and the age of median onset for literacy has decreased. We read to our children from birth and begin to teach them to read and write as soon as they develop sufficient fine motor control. Some take to it eagerly. In other cases, it's a struggle for children and adults alike. I am the parent of a 16-year-old who is an excellent reader and an excellent high school student, but man, was it a chore to get her to learn to read. She's dyslexic, but she managed. We managed. It wasn't fun. As parents, we persist in the struggle, even when we know it's traumatic for our children. We would not inflict such trauma for the sake of developmental goals of any lesser value, nor would we tolerate it, for that matter, in our neighbors if they inflicted such trauma on their children. Literacy is instilled wherever possible, even at significant cost. Instilling literacy in very young children with their plastic brains opens them to numerous interactions to which they could not otherwise aspire. It also rewires those brains such that literate humans exposed to text written in their primary language no longer have the option of not reading it. Literate brains read text faster than we perform a host of other visual perceptual tasks. Short of looking away, we cannot not read text, even if it is systematically misspelled. In universal literacy, we have an example of a historically emergent phenomenon, a recent one, that sets the boundary conditions for human ontogenesis, for development and learning. And with it, another clear example of the normative metaphysics of the emergence of anticipations, an example whose specific timescale is not cosmological, not geological, paleoanthropological, or even historical, but rather developmental. Early onset literacy, in turn, makes possible the emergence of interactive anticipations for interactions on the millisecond timescale of frog predation. That's how fast we read. Conclusion: the interactive timescales of cognition and action. I began by inviting you to consider interactivism as a philosophical system, one whose goals and whose tools largely coincide, but not entirely, with those of the system envisioned a century ago by Roy Wood Sellers. If, as Sellers argues, quote, philosophy is the science which explains the other sciences as human achievements and thereby complete science, then interactivism can pursue the completion of science by addressing the normativity of the anticipations inherent in human interactions with each other and with our shared environments. Pursuing this goal requires many parallel efforts. One such effort consists in showing how the timescales of the other special sciences, including cosmology, geology, evolutionary biology, and so on, how the timescales of the other special sciences we invoke, explaining the diachronic emergence of humanity and of particular human beings, set boundary conditions for each other. One product of this effort is a more nuanced account of biological function, and thus of the kinds of historicity presupposed by teleosemantics. Another outcome might well be a more nuanced understanding of what it means for humans or other agents to interact with each other and with their environments, quote, in real time. Real-time interactions can occur on various timescales. Which of them are relevant to the validation of intelligent interactions, intelligent agency, will depend on the particular normativities applicable to the success or failure of the interactions in question. Thanks.
All right, thank you. And any questions? Johanna.
Well, Alex, fantastic talk. Thank you so much. Thank you also for reminding us of Roy Wood Sellers. Undeservedly forgotten as his son, Wilfrid Sellers. Anyway, my question is the following. I like very much, I mean, a small remark perhaps first. What you say about philosophy with reference to Sellers, that philosophy sort of has to be self-applicatory and explain how it all itself came about, knowledge and so on. That I would say is perhaps, for me, the characteristics of metaphysics. So it is a specific brand, perhaps more of philosophy, but that's something we can discuss. So I think it's very legitimate for philosophers also to follow the scientists and restrict themselves and cut out something and do some solid work in a restricted area. That was the side remark. But my question is this. I find it extremely helpful that you draw attention to these timescales, but would you go so far as to say, when you question the certain analogies, that we cannot compare the structures or the dynamics of processes across timescales?
You know, that's going to depend on the processes in question. I mean, some sorts of processes, we see, self-similarity at different resolutions when we expand or contract our temporal scope. So it's not, so in those cases, because there are good dynamic reasons for self-similarity, because we have good explanations in dynamical systems theory for self-similarity, no problem at all in making comparisons across timescales. In other cases, it might very well be problematic. I mean, the example I gave, one example I gave, analogies between evolution and development, between phylogenesis and ontogenesis. Well, I mean, in the 19th century, German evolutionary thinker Ernst Haeckel was famously a recapitulationist. That view, the idea that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, has been discredited for a long time, despite the way some embryologists reinterpreted Weismann's results. Recapitulationist view of development is false. The fact is, when Weismannian segregation applies, as it does for animals like us, we always start out simple and small, and grow complicated and large, and eventually either reproduce or not. And that's not how evolution works. Speciation just does not work that way. You get speciation events in which members of the daughter species are more or less complex than members of the parent species. You get speciation events in which the population dynamics of the daughter species are more or less complex than those of the parent species. There are very, very important disanalogies that are revealed by the divergent timescales of evolution and development. And those disanalogies are in this case significant. So I guess my answer to your question is, it depends. As to your remark, I mean, I agree with you. Not everybody has to do this in order to be a philosopher. I mean, you can specialize in philosophy as you can in everything else. I'm not sure that we would properly call what Sellers is doing just metaphysics, although he might have been happy with that. I think it's systematic philosophy in the sense in which it was criticized by Hans Weinger, for instance, when he talked about Hegel's Systemwahn, the mania of systems, the mania for systems, with which 19th century German philosophy is sometimes caricatured. It's the attempt simultaneously to address the competing demands of very different branches of philosophical inquiry, or at least to show how they could be addressed simultaneously.
All right. Did you still have more comment, Johanna, or no? Okay, Jed.
First question is just simple. Is this a published paper, Alex?
No, not as of the time I printed it out.
Okay.
I mean, I can share it with everybody. I mean, I have the text. What I haven't done is add my references, but if you're okay with it as it is, I'll share it now. If not, you can wait until I can type up a bibliography over the next couple of days.
Okay. Yeah, I may email you. And then the second one is a clarification, and then just sort of an open-ended question that you may or may not be familiar with. The clarification was, did you say that you're suggesting that fairly robust culture comes before the release of selection pressures against a big brain?
It's a necessary condition for the release of selection pressures against big brain.
Okay, and so
that's the cooking hypothesis, as Richard Wrangham calls it.
Okay, and so I'm curious.
And now, yeah.
Are you familiar with animal literature on talking about different species and the extent to which it seems like maybe they do have culture? And
sure.
Could you share some of that? Because I'm getting more and more interested in looking at animals a little bit more closely and the
Look,
extent.
behavioral ethology and the study of cultural learning in non-human animals is fascinating. I find work on corvid birds especially fascinating. There's a biologist at Clarkson University who has been studying populations of Central American corvids, jays, for over 30 years. And there are, very, very robust mechanisms for differentiating cultures, for establishing shared repositories of skills and methods. All of this has been extensively studied in, not in all conceivably interesting populations, but in many of them. Of course, what gets a lot more attention are studies, for example, of cultural evolution in chimp populations. And those are interesting too, but the opportunity to study them is, the opportunity to study apes is constrained by the fact that we've essentially wiped them out. Whereas, there's still plenty of corvids out there for us to study in situ.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, cultural learning conditions natural selection, not just in the hominin lineage. I assume this happens everywhere. It's just that most of my best friends happen to be human. So yeah.
Thanks.
All
And
righty.
those other examples of cultures haven't yet developed cooking.
Right. Though, though quite a few non-human cultures have developed other methods of food preparation.
Yeah.
Of outsourcing some of the burden of metabolizing their food to the environment. But cooking seems to be pretty much our thing, a hominin thing.
Mark?
I just wanted to have a kind of a follow-up on your discussion of teleosemantics. Ruth keeps presenting teleosemantics in a way that sounds unobjectionable, and she even said that. And the generality with which she's characterizing it may make that correct, or at least unobjectionable from an interactivist perspective. Because what she's talking about is teleosemantics as saying that something like representing or something like representations have to have evolved. Well, okay, I would agree with that at that level of generality. But the way she usually says it is representations have to evolve, or something creating representations have to have evolved. And all of her examples are, or most of her examples are, models of representing that seem to me to be real clear instances of what I criticize as encodingism examples. But let me go to her real general claim and ignore the way, for the time being, ignore the way that she herself, as well as I think most others, cash it out. What I claim is that any agent has to have indications that anticipate interactive possibilities. Those have to have evolved. So evolution has to be the explanation for the coming into existence of things like brain processes that set up indications of interactive potentiality. Those aren't representations per se. They are the framework within, or the processes within which, if this model is correct, representing in the sense of bearing truth value emerges. So with that shift, I could agree with this real general statement about teleosemantics, and it gives a way of thinking about how to integrate the two relevant timescales. I mean, I've never tried to deny that indications of potential interactions are or the possibility of having indications of potential interactions. I've never tried to deny that that itself is a product of evolution. Evolution explains ideology, or ideology explains etiology. And so you need an account. And you gave a real rough outline of some aspects of that, you know, central nervous systems and so on and so on. But if you state that in the sense of, well, it has to have been representations that got selected, then you've got a problem, because then you have to have representation before it can be selected. But if representations are constituted in the selection history, you've got no account. You have to have emergence.
It's spandrels, as Gould and Lewontin called them. I mean, it's Panglossianism, in addition to being suffering from the vicious regress of encodingism.
Yeah. Well, I would even accept that as a conceptual possibility, although a practical impossibility. But the trouble is they don't explain what the spandrel is and how it works.
Yeah.
Or how it could possibly work.
This has always been my beef with Ruth Milligan's work. You know, to the extent to which the claim is unobjectionable, it has to be vacuous. You know, no, it's we're getting our late afternoon thunderstorms in the background. So if you hear thunder in the background, that's why. I mean, this is true for any trivially true proposition. It doesn't tell you very much. In order for it to tell you something, you have to look in. You have to get your hands dirty with the actual evolutionary history of the lineage in question. And when you do that, you discover numerous contingencies, including those that give rise to the constraints under which anticipations can, under which the sorts of representations you talk about can arise. So yeah, it may be that the necessary conditions for forming that sort of representation are, in some very loose sense, explained by evolution. But in what sense, one wants to know, because the system hasn't just evolved. I mean, it also has culture and history and its own individual ontogenesis.
No, completely.
Oh,
agree.
and by the way, also evolution also repurposes stuff all the time. I mean, you know, and stuff and structures or systems that evolve for one proper function end up serving other functions, and those other functions they serve end up becoming the functions they have. And you know, this happens in evolution. This is uncontroversial.
I guess since nobody else raised their hand, I thought I would raise my own hand. I apologize for the conflict of interest, but a couple comments. One that goes in the direction that Mark, that y'all were just talking about, and one goes in a different direction entirely. It seems to me like you could get closer to having and serving a function in teleosemantics if you just stop with, or if you stop at use, right? So she says, she uses the example of items having names that tell their function, and says, well, the proper function is the use for which it was designed. But what if you just stop at use and forget about proper? I mean, that's one example of function, but it doesn't seem like it's general enough. That the more general case is use. So what is the thing being used for? And then the question about selection and design, really design, is answering the question, not so, I mean, in part, why does it still exist now after however many cycles of birth but why is it the way it is? Why does it have the structure that it does, right? So in the case of people designing things, then you can ask what they designed it to do, and what are the material constraints and all those kinds of things. There's similar kinds of arguments that can be made for evolutionary history, but the constraints are a lot more are going to be a lot more dynamic. They will fluctuate over generations. They're going to involve other things that are going on at the same time. And it may well be that something gets used and has a function that for something that it had nothing, that it had no prior selection history for, right? It's just that by the time it got to the structure that it has, or the organization that it has, it became useful for something else. And then the history changes for that reason. But in general, it seems like the question of use is considerably more general. The one thing it leaves out is the question of the mere fact that it's being used for something doesn't necessarily imply anything about normativity other than whether it actually does the thing that it's being used for. So I guess that actually
does. See, it doesn't even get you that, because you could use anything to do just about anything. I mean, it doesn't mean that you'll do it very well. What you need to, you need an account of use that also accommodates abuse. Now, you're not always going to get that. Is there a fact of the matter, for example, about whether this morning I succeeded in making scrambled eggs or failed at making an omelet? Is there a fact of the matter? Obviously, it depends. Either way, I got breakfast. But was that the function of what I was doing? Was the cooking process in which I engaged designed for breakfast making or omelet making? I mean, it matters. Of course, the limiting case of design. I mean, if design is the paradigm case source of function, of an account of function, we still have problems, because the limiting case of design is simply ostension. I pick up the rock, and by the act of picking it up, it becomes a hand axe.
Exactly right. Yeah.
I haven't modified it in any way. Think about that moment in 2001 when the ape picks up the femur and uses it to. I mean,
yeah. Or it can use a cell phone as a paperweight, right?
Yeah. In fact, I'm doing it right now. Of course, that really is. I mean, when we talk about a hand axe, that really is the limiting case of design. You start by picking up a rock, then you find a better rock, then you realize that you can break the rocks and change their shapes and so on. I mean, that's a just so story. That's not serious, but there's a continuum between ostension, between even distal interaction on the one hand and design on the other, and presumably a continuum of different senses and different kinds of function as well. Now, if that's true when it comes to what for Millikan and many philosophers remains the paradigm case of function, the artifact, then why should it not also be the case for natural functions? Why should there not be all sorts of different degrees and kinds of function and functionality?
Now, my other comment, since there still aren't any other hands up, which feel free if anybody has any comments, is so you were talking about the time scales, and it got me thinking about there's this project that I'm working on, or have been working on ostensibly, with Michael Turvey. This kind of paper that he wanted me to write, trying to connect Swenson's maximum entropy production principle with answering the question of why there's so much variety of life. And one of the things that I discovered as I was doing my research for this is that there seems to be, I mean, there's a number of theories. So these are still kind of, unsettled matters, okay? But what looks to me like the best kind of answers to questions like where do eukaryotes, or why are there eukaryotes, or why are there humans, they all seem to revolve around questions about a change in the amount of energy that's involved. But typically, like what you were talking about earlier with Wrangham's hypothesis about cooking, it's put in terms of, oh, now there's more energy available to do more things. But I kind of think it's more like there's a constraint that's been lifted because we're now cooking food and we have more calories and we don't have to spend so much time chewing and all that kind of stuff. Or in the case of eukaryotes, we now have endosymbiotic biotic bacteria that have inside of a archaeum that are producing energy or producing ATP. There's energy there, and you got to do something with it, right? Like something has to happen with it, otherwise it's just going to boil over, right? Like in a boiling pot of fluid. But anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that the structure that arises around it seems to be a way of kind of diffusing that extra energy. But the main thing I wanted to point out regarding scales is that each one of these seems to, the key constraint that's being released seems to be time. So when you go from bacterium to eukaryotes, or bacteria, sorry, or really prokaryotes in general, their reproduction rates are incredibly fast. And the reason for this is because they're really fast and they tend to not have very many genes. They can't develop very much complexity, in part because there's just not enough energy available to produce that complexity. But the other part of it is, if something else is, if another bacterial colony is reproducing faster, they're going to dominate the environment pretty quickly. I mean, we're talking about milliseconds difference in time. So there's just no time to be, keeping genes that you don't need, especially because if you need them at some point, they're still available through viruses and other, horizontal gene transfer. The same kind of thing I think is happening also with the move from non-cooking to cooking.
Phil, do you want to clarify your question, or if you want to summarize?
Oh no, I was just bringing it up. It just seems like there's an interesting scale thing happening where there's more and more time available.
It may be true, but whenever you ask these why questions, like why do we have the particular diversity or distribution of biota on this planet that we discover, you have to remember that those questions cannot be asked under the assumption that there is a necessarily true or indeed even a singular answer.
Yeah.
Evolution is contingent, and there's always some place to put the waste energy other than investing it in additional complexity. We vent waste heat all over the place. I mean, life on this planet is super wasteful, and fortunately, we arose at a point in the cosmological life cycle where we can get away with it. So,
well, whether that part of it is correct, probably the more interesting point is that it seems like with each of these transitions, you get a kind of, or at least with many of them anyway, perhaps not all of them, like you were just suggesting, but nevertheless, there does seem to be an increasing amount of time that gets opened up to engaging in whatever activities that the organism is engaged in. So this, for instance, happens with the eukaryotes, who reproduce at much slower rates than, even at the microbe level, than bacteria and archaea. And then reproduction is not the issue after that, right? So anyway, it was,
Ken has his hand up, by the way. I think he has a question.
oh, yeah, Ken, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you. I've been enjoying all of this, and I'm grateful to Alex Levine for reminding us again of Roywood Cellars. And just to show you're not entirely alone, I've put the evolutionary naturalism into the chat. But I wanted to come back to this point, and I feel a little bit uncomfortable raising this at a time when Ruth Milliken isn't with us, but the issue has come up here. And I'll just mention then that part of what has troubled me about her way of characterizing the teleosemantics is that it seems to be, as she puts it, Janus face. Right? Teleosemantics is forward-looking, what can I do with this, whatever the this is? Whereas she keeps going back to historicity about where did it come from? And sometimes the two are closely aligned, as in well-made artifacts, but typically a whole lot of our artifacts can be used for more than one thing, sometimes more or less efficiently, right? An old surge suppressor makes a great doorstop. There's a whole lot of those around our department, right? Not what it was made for, but it sure does the job. So it seems to me that part of what your talk has done is reminded us that the history of where it came from only tells us how we got it. What it might do for us, what we might be able to do with it, that's a further question. And what has always attracted me about what Mark Pickard is doing is that the use is anticipatory, right? We have to be able to do something with sufficient effectiveness going forward. And what that might have to do with how we got this that can be used in some anticipatory way is contingent. And sometimes they're closely aligned. Sometimes it's a lot of dumb luck. Am I following your point, Alex?
Yeah, I think that's right. And if it were not the case that teleosemantics is, as you put it, Janus face with one retrospective visage and the other prospective, then it would be of no conceivable interest to an interactivist. What's of interest is the idea that contingently and under certain boundary conditions, historicity does inform anticipation, but of course it doesn't always.
Right. Thank you.
By the way, Alex, I just wanted to mention Lucas Thorpe is going to give a talk tomorrow, the same time slot as yours, where the title is Pluralistic Teleosemantics, Why We Need Both Bickered Representations and Millikan Representations.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
So if you're able to make it, it might make for a good, ring match.
I will do my best.
What do you suppose he could possibly have in mind?
Oh, he actually posted the text in the chat, so we can have a anticipatory look.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, he put it here.
If you want to plumb the realm of pure possibility, you're going to have to go back and keep Tempe company. I don't recommend it.
Yeah. No, I'm done.
If
with
I can
13th
stay
century
awake
Paris.
until that time tomorrow.
All right, anybody else? I thought you were announcing your departure earlier, Lucas.
No, I was still listening. It's just quite late here. It's like it's almost 11.
Well, since it seems like nobody has any more comments or questions, maybe now would be a good time to bring day 2 of Interactivism in Perspective to an end.
Thank you all, and thanks for the talks earlier today. It's been a great,
Okay.
great conversation. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thanks everybody
Alex.
for coming.
Thanks. Take care.